In the minds of Australians and global audiences throughout the 1980s, Paul Hogan was more than an actor. He was the embodiment of the Australian spirit, easygoing, humorous, and resilient. From a humble Sydney Harbour Bridge painter, he rose to become a global icon through his role as Crocodile Dundee. That success was so immense that it not only transformed his bank account, but completely reshaped the structure of his personal life. But behind the somewhat cheeky smile seen on screen was a story far less glamorous. It was the story of Noeline Edwards, the woman who stood beside him for 30 years, from the days when they struggled to pay bills to the moment he became one of the most famous men on the planet. They were an ordinary couple who built everything together from nothing, only to discover that once the empire had been created, it became the very thing that separated them. Paul Hogan's rise was every artist's dream, but for Noeline it marked the beginning of a nightmare she never anticipated. Fate brought him together with Linda Kozlowski, the beautiful and intelligent co-star from New York. And there on the film set, in a moment where art and reality collided, Paul Hogan chose a different path. A marriage that had endured for 3 decades, through countless highs and lows, was ultimately replaced by the allure of a new life and a new connection forged on screen. Together, we will examine whether that transformation was a natural evolution of human experience or a scar left behind by the spotlight on the lives it touched. To understand the tragedy of the later separation, we must return to a time when everything began with pure love and simple dreams. In 1958, at the Granville Olympic Pool, the young lifeguard Paul Hogan met Noeline Edwards. There were no stage lights, no film scripts, only youth and the desire to build a home together. They married later that year and began a journey spanning more than 3 decades, with the innocent belief that shared hardship would create an unbreakable bond. At that time, Paul Hogan embodied the Australian working-class spirit. He took on various manual jobs, the toughest of which was painting on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, where he spent his days suspended from enormous steel structures beneath the blazing harbour sun. While Paul laboured among paintbrushes and dust, Noeline remained the family's foundation, managing the household and raising their 5 children, Brett, Clay, Scott, Todd and Lauren, while constantly stretching a limited budget. Each evening, when Paul returned home from work, he was not a celebrity. He was an exhausted father and a husband longing for the warmth of family life. For Noeline, happiness was simply having her husband present alongside their children. They shared modest meals, everyday worries, and simple laughter. During those years, Noeline was more than a wife. She was a companion, a homemaker, and the anchor that kept their small family steady against the harsh realities of working life. It was this period that later led Paul Hogan to describe those years as the most genuine years of his life. But fame, like a gathering storm at sea, had already begun to form in the distance, preparing to sweep away the peace they had worked so hard to create. Could a love built upon sacrifice and hardship withstand the dazzling temptations of a more privileged world? If the years at the harbour represented unity, then 1971 became the turning point that permanently altered the course of Paul Hogan's life. His appearance on the television programme New Faces was initially intended as a joke, a bold act of defiance by a bridge painter who wanted to mock judges he considered overly rigid. Yet life is often built on paradoxes. That very act of rebellion transformed him into a sensation that all of Australia embraced. Fame arrived like a flood. A man accustomed only to the smell of paint and the sound of harbour winds suddenly became a face recognised everywhere. For Noeline, this transformation brought not joy but constant anxiety. She was a family-oriented woman who valued stability and wanted Paul to remain the father of their 5 children. Yet, demanding production schedules, endless late-night gatherings, and relentless public attention gradually pulled Paul away from the peaceful home they had built. The differences began with the smallest things. Their conversations no longer revolved around the children's education or plans for the family home, but became dominated by media pressure and Paul's rapidly expanding artistic ambitions. Noeline felt left behind, not because she lacked ability, but because Paul's world had become far larger than the life they had once created together. Whenever Paul returned home, he was no longer the humble bridge painter Noeline had fallen in love with. He was a star, struggling beneath the weight of his own success. Arguments became more frequent and more intense. The understanding that had once anchored their family now wavered beneath the waves of fame. Paul Hogan was swept into the current of a new life, while Noeline found herself torn between preserving the man she once knew and accepting the reality that her husband had changed. The breaking point came in 1981, when their first divorce officially ended 23 years together. It was a painful decision and an acknowledgement that their paths no longer converged. When Paul packed his belongings and left the family home, it was not only personal possessions that disappeared. The memories of their 5 children and the sacrifices Noeline had made over 3 decades were fractured as well. It became a deep emotional wound, where love was replaced by the unfamiliarity of 2 people who had once meant everything to each other. After the divorce in 1981, silence settled over Paul Hogan's life. Yet that silence became a mirror, revealing that despite his professional success, a profound loneliness remained within him. Less than a year later, both shocked the public by deciding to reunite and remarry in 1982. At the time, it was seen as proof that love could overcome adversity. Noeline accepted that Paul would continue pursuing his artistic ambitions, while Paul genuinely believed they could start again. Yet rather than bringing peace, the reunion occurred just as he was entering the most ambitious period of his career. He became the face of Australia's tourism campaign with the legendary phrase, "Shrimp on the Barbie." The campaign was more than an advertisement. It became the launchpad that introduced Paul Hogan to American audiences. The former bridge painter had become the international symbol of Australia. Yet while he was focused on winning over audiences abroad, the seeds of a film project called Crocodile Dundee were also being planted. Paul Hogan did not simply want to act in films. He wanted to create a legacy, a film deeply rooted in his own identity. In his eyes, Crocodile Dundee represented everything. He devoted all of his passion, time, and creativity to the screenplay and casting process. It was a gamble he was willing to risk everything on in pursuit of success in Hollywood. Their home in Sydney gradually became little more than a temporary stop, rather than a true family sanctuary. Their reunion unintentionally became the calm before the storm. Paul was consumed by preparations for the journey he believed would change his life, while Noeline remained behind, trying to preserve what remained of a marriage already marked by countless scars. Neither realized that another destiny was waiting on the upcoming film set, one that would erase every effort they had made to rebuild their relationship. In 1985, when production on Crocodile Dundee officially began, no one, not even Paul Hogan, could have predicted that the film would not only transform his career, but also devastate his private life. When producers searched for an actress to play journalist Sue Charlton, Linda Kozlowski, a professionally trained stage actress from New York, arrived like an unexpected new force. The contrast between them was striking. One was a self-taught Australian comedian with the relaxed, rough-edged manner of a harbour worker. The other was a polished theatre actress, sophisticated, intelligent, and shaped by life in a major city. During the early days of filming, the partnership was filled with tension. Linda, with her rigorous professional standards, initially viewed Paul as distant and even somewhat unprofessional because of his free-spirited approach to performance. They shared little common ground, no immediate connection, and on set, the distance between them was measured by mutual skepticism. Yet director Peter Feynman, a man known for bold creative instincts, made a decision that would change everything. He chose to film the movie in chronological order. This arrangement unintentionally created a laboratory for emotions. As Mick Dundee and Sue Charlton gradually fell in love, grew to understand one another, and formed a bond amid the rugged landscapes of Australia, Paul and Linda also began to mirror those feelings. It was a magical and captivating process. When the cameras stopped rolling, the emotions did not disappear. They continued to grow beneath the stars of the outback, where only the two of them remained, and the love stories written on paper slowly became real life. Paul Hogan, the man who was trying to preserve his second marriage to Noeline after so many hardships, found himself completely captivated by Linda's charm. To him, Linda represented an entirely different world, a world of art and professional understanding that he had never shared with his former wife. Gradually, the boundaries between performance and personal life became blurred. Paul was no longer acting for the camera, he had begun acting for his own heart. The affair began like a gentle breeze, yet it carried devastating consequences. While Noeline remained at home, believing in the marriage she had rebuilt and trusting that family would always come first, Paul's heart had already drifted towards Linda. Evenings spent reading scripts together and the glances exchanged after romantic scenes gradually laid the foundations for a quiet yet ruthless betrayal. At the time, Paul failed to realize that he was not merely making a film, he was writing the final chapter of the family he had worked so hard to restore. After Crocodile Dundee premiered in 1986 and became a worldwide box office phenomenon, the reality of Paul and Noeline's second marriage finally collapsed. For Paul, the film represented the greatest triumph of his career. For Noeline, it was a death sentence for a marriage that had lasted 30 years. While the film's success was still at its peak, Paul moved out of the family home, leaving behind the wife who had stood by him since his struggling days and their 5 children. This betrayal did not take place in secret. It unfolded under the flashbulbs of the global media. For Noeline, it was not only the pain of being abandoned by her husband, but also a public humiliation. She had stood beside him through the hardest years, helped raise 5 children on a modest income, and shared every sacrifice along the way, only to become part of a forgotten past the moment success arrived. The second divorce was anything but amicable. It evolved into a fierce legal battle dominated by financial disputes. With a fortune exceeding $328 million generated by the film's success, the division of assets became a major public spectacle. Australians who had once embraced Paul as a national hero and an ordinary man who represented them suddenly turned against him. Many felt betrayed by the very person who had embodied their values. In the eyes of many Australians at the time, Linda Kozlowski was no longer simply a talented actress, but the woman blamed for breaking apart a traditional family. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the divorce was the silence that followed. Paul Hogan completely cut off contact with Noeline for many years. That silence became a wall separating him from the woman who had devoted her youth to him. Their children found themselves caught in the middle of a bitter legal conflict, trapped between their mother's anger and their father's increasingly luxurious new lifestyle. Paul had sacrificed everything: his image as a trustworthy Australian, his connection to his family, and much of the respect he once enjoyed among his supporters at home. He seemed to believe that immense wealth and a flourishing career could buy a new kind of happiness. Yet he overlooked one crucial truth. When the fame fades and the legal bills are paid, what remains is often the loneliness of a man who has burned down his own anchor. In 1990, Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski officially married. It was a lavish wedding that attracted intense media attention, a complete contrast to the simplicity of the ceremony in 1958. Yet beneath the surface, the marriage appeared to be built upon unfamiliar foundations, where cinematic success served as the primary bond rather than the shared struggles that had connected him to Noeline. They welcomed their son, Chance, in 1998 and chose to settle permanently in Los Angeles. It was a strategic move designed in part to escape the harsh judgment of the Australian public, many of whom never truly forgave Paul for the way he had treated his first wife. In Los Angeles, they lived among celebrities, far removed from the working-class values Paul had once represented. However, the shadow of Crocodile Dundee was enormous, and in many ways it consumed Linda's life. When they first met, she had been a talented and independent actress. Over the following 20 years, she gradually withdrew from the screen, setting aside her own career to support her husband. Ironically, that sacrifice became one of the factors that slowly drove them apart. As they grew older, differences in personality, lifestyle, and personal interests became increasingly apparent. Paul, once the carefree Australian adventurer, grew more reserved, while Linda longed for a deeper connection that Hollywood glamour could never provide. The inevitable ending arrived in 2013 after nearly 30 years together. The separation felt like a sorrowful echo from the past. History repeated itself in the most painful way possible. Paul Hogan was divorced once again. Linda had once seemed destined to replace Noeline, yet in the end, he was unable to keep the flame alive in this marriage either. The divorce from Linda was less dramatic than the legal conflict with Noeline, but it carried a deeper sadness. The sadness of a man who had traveled through most of his life without discovering how to sustain a lasting relationship. The second marriage ended not because of another affair, but because of the gradual erosion caused by time and the emotional emptiness that had developed within a relationship he had sacrificed so much to obtain. At the age of 87, Paul Hogan now lives in Los Angeles, thousands of miles away from the Sydney beaches where he once worked as a lifeguard. His home is quieter now, filled mainly with the company of his son Chance and memories that never fade. Linda Kozlowski has remarried and chosen to leave the Hollywood spotlight behind entirely, a form of freedom she may have been seeking for many years. For Paul, these later years have become a painful dialogue with himself. After 2 failed marriages, after losing the wife who shared humble meals and difficult times with him, and after seeing the relationship with the woman for whom he risked his reputation also come to an end, he appears to have arrived at a stark realization. He is a man who is easy to love, but difficult to live with. In the rare interviews he has given in recent years, there is little trace of the carefree Mick Dundee or the humorous figure once seen on New Faces. Instead, there is a man who has experienced both extraordinary success and profound disappointment. He admits that despite having achieved everything, wealth, fame, and relationships that once seemed like scenes from a film, he has struggled to maintain enduring emotional bonds. The loneliness of old age is not necessarily a tragedy, but it can be a haunting form of stillness. Paul Hogan now understands that fame can buy almost anything except lasting understanding. He once left everything behind in pursuit of something new, only to discover that what remained in the end were wills, divorce settlements, and a reputation gradually worn down by time. Today, when he looks into the mirror, the bridge painter he once was might scarcely recognize himself beneath the glow of Hollywood success. He has lived a life filled with experiences, yet one that seems to have lacked the roots of genuine peace. Paul Hogan stands as a powerful example of a legend consumed by his own dream. He remains an icon and a legend, but inside a quiet house in Los Angeles, he is simply a man trying to come to terms with a difficult truth. Sometimes the greatest mistake is not walking away, but believing that happiness can be found anywhere other than the place where it all began.